system is quite complicated to get in. So congratulations to everybody who is already here. 24, 25, welcome also to number 26. Don't worry, this is anonymous. We can't see who you are, we can only see the abstract numbers. So we seem to be stabilizing at 29 right now. One has left. Hopefully nobody thinks that we are not going to start our panel discussion. We will. We're just going to give it a 1 or 2 minutes until everybody has negotiated their way into this session room. And let's give it 1 more minute and then we'll get started. Everybody else is already lined up. So your panelists are here, your moderators are here. And we see there are 30 people online. So even once it's digital, we are in Germany, and therefore sort of time is of the essence, and we're trying to be as punctual as possible. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to day 3 of the Energy's Future Emerging Pathways in an Uncertain World. That's, of course, as you know, the digital edition of the Energy Futures Conference 2021, organized by the Leibniz Research Alliance on Energy Transitions. My name is Conny Schimmer. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm feeling very honored to do that with so many esteemed, fantastic economists. So my co-moderator is Professor Dr. Sonja Petersen, and she's not only wearing the hat of being professor herself, but she's also in the organizing team of this conference. So it's up to you, Sonja, to greet everybody that's in the session. And we're now reaching the number of 36.
My screen already shows 39, so welcome also from my side. One of the many hats that I'm wearing is actually that I'm representing the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in this Leibniz Research Alliance on Energy Transition. And I thought that in this final Energy Futures Conference that this Research Alliance is organizing, all economic research centers in the Leibniz community, or most of them, which are represented also in this alliance, should have a visible part. So I'm very happy that today I got 4 of my colleagues here on the panel as the first session this morning. And what the economic research institutions are known for in Leibniz is that they combine research and, let's say, outreach activities and policy advice. And this is the spirit in which I said, me and Connie, together with the other organizers from the Leibniz Research Alliance, set up this panel. And I look forward to hopefully a very inspiring discussion today.
Well, wonderful. Thank you very much. And there you have it. Sonja and I are in the same room, and yet we see different numbers. That might be one of the issues in economics as well. And therefore, I'm quite sure we're going to have a different light on the issues that we're going to be discussing. So Sonja is going to continue being a co-moderator. She's going to be properly in it. But first of all, let me just do a very, very brief run through and then go in depth a bit more. We just have this absolutely fantastic panel of 4 people. Let me kick off with Gabriel Felbermeier, President of the Kiel Institute of the World for the World Economy, IFW Kiel. Just a brief good morning to Kiel. And whilst we're digital, it's still quite quite nice to know that people are actually somewhere. Karen Pittel is director of the IFO Center for Energy, Climate and Resources, and she's also for the last year and a half, she's replaced Dirk Messner in the WBGO BU, and we'll be hearing about that in a moment. Carsten Neuhoff, very, very important advisor in many areas. He's the head of climate policy department of the DIW in Berlin. And last but not least, Catherine van Grevenitz. She is the deputy head of the Department of Environmental and Resource Economics and Environmental Management, ZEW in Mannheim. And so we have the whole Republic represented already. Carsten, everything is okay? Yeah. And Carsten, as you can see, has already the light on him. We have basically to share that with you, ladies and gentlemen, and I count 43 right at the moment. We have set ourselves the goal of touching upon three major issues. First of all, what's the discussion, what's the dialogue, what's the action going to be this year in the run-up to COP26, what is going to happen due to the fact that the Americans seem to be back, certainly verbally, on track. Part of the discussion that we're going to talk about, how is building back better going to include the green aspect? Is it just sort of greening of a recovery package, or is it core? That's the second issue. And then, of course, we want to look at technologies that will enable the pathway that eventually will hopefully lead to 2050 and a zero carbon society. So that was our quick run through, but we do appreciate your questions. And Sonia, could you just help us quickly on how people can participate, on how they can put questions to us?
Yes, so hopefully everybody, if you see this picture with the small question mark, like a screen with this question mark, should be on the left of your screen. And if you go on it, point on it, it says questions and answers. And that's where all of you are very much encouraged to type in questions, can also be comments, and my role will be here to have a look at them and to also maybe consolidate them a bit, or put different questions together and then ask them to our audience. And yes, as I said, I look forward to see a lot of action in this field there.
Grand. Okay, so let's get started. We have decided not to have big inputs right at the beginning, but we're going to have more of a dialogue, and I hope that we're going to have a sort of spread of opinions as much as possible. Let's do the first question and just a general and quick answer. What do you, from your different perspectives, from the different advice that you are giving diverse governments, what is your perspective on the most important next step that we need to take? And we're going to go to America in a second round. And maybe let's kick off with our Northern Light, with Gabriel first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Connie, and welcome to everyone who is in this conference, be it 48 or 51 people. I have both numbers on my screen, right? They can't be right at the same time. So this is interesting software we are using here. But anyhow, it's all in the usual conference intervals. So it's about 50 people, and we'd be fine with that accuracy. Now, what I think is of crucial importance in the run-up to the Glasgow event in November is that we really hammer out new avenues for global cooperation. I think the corona crisis has shown how immensely important that is. We've seen that solutions can be brought about and can be brought about quickly. I think the race for the vaccine has shown that, technology can be part of the equation and it can move fast. Now, the climate challenge is bigger than the corona challenge, no doubt about that. But I think the value of global cooperation has been highlighted in the current crisis. And that's, I think we'll be talking about that in more detail. Connie has already mentioned, of course, that window of opportunity that might be open now. And it's not just the United States. I think it's broader than that. Signals around the world are quite encouraging. And so I think what now needs to be done is the footwork to be able to bring real solutions to Glasgow. And these solutions will require from Germany, from the European Union, from industrial countries, more than just warm words and promises of more money. We need more concrete elements that foster global cooperation and that also might, put the hands on old dogmas. I'm talking about principles like common and differential responsibility, or in the trade law jargon, special and differential treatment. We need to be more honest about the role of emerging and developing countries in the process. That's difficult and painful. I think that's one of the areas where I personally am interested in, and I think the Institute of the World Economy in Kiel is interested in. We need to make the climate battle a truly global battle if it is to be successful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for laying down the line. And I, without further ado, I'd like to bring in Karen. So, of course, being now co-chairman of WBGO as one of the many aspects that you're covering, and looking at it from the south, from Munich, and of course from IFO, what's your take? What's the most urgent thing to do?
I mean, from a Glasgow perspective, I would agree with Gabriel. Yes, can you hear me? Okay, everybody but you can hear me, apparently. Doesn't seem to be my problem. I'll just continue and hope that your sound is going to work again. So on the one hand, of course, Glasgow, very important, the ratcheting up of the goals. So where do we go? We know that the Paris goals so far are not tight enough to actually accomplish the 1.5 or 2 degree target. Another aspect that I consider really important, especially from a developing country perspective, is the flexibility mechanisms about which there will be a decision, or at least it's the aim to find a decision on, meaning regarding offsetting, regarding global carbon markets. And there's a lot of chance in developing countries in for that, but there's also a lot of challenges for global policy, but also for the developing countries. So perhaps we can or want to talk a little bit about that later on. But of course, just implementing targets and implementing mechanisms is not enough. You also have to implement concrete measures within the countries, especially within the industrialized countries and countries like China, whether it's a transition country or industrialized countries, I don't want to discuss here. But I mean, with respect to the US, we definitely have to see a ratcheting up of their 2030 target now that they are committing to the 2050 climate neutrality. We'll see how far that will be possible. With respect to China, they have also announced their 2060 target as climate neutrality, but we haven't really seen them implementing the necessary measures. And with respect to the EU and their 2050 climate neutrality target, this is going to be a really interesting year to actually see what type of measures are going to be implemented. A lot of decisions are supposed to happen within the first half year, but if you just take a look at the EU basically timeline for decisions, this will last far beyond that. And of course, with respect to recovery, perhaps touching upon that just very shortly, and I'm taking really shamelessly my time here because Connie doesn't seem to hear us. Do you hear us now? We don't hear you.
So everybody's agreeing right at the moment. I'm not quite sure whether I'm interrupting, Karen.
Yes.
I have not heard a word that you've been saying, but I know from separate conversation that everybody has heard you. Just in case that's going to continue. So whenever I put a question to Karen, Sonja, you must pick it up afterwards, please. Is that okay? Can we play
Yeah, and
that
if you
way?
can't hear the others, I can take over the moderation in the first round until you hear something, because it's very difficult not
I
to
heard
hear.
Gabriel perfectly. I didn't hear Karen. I assume that you're almost there because everybody was grinning. So I assume that. So should I have interrupted you, Karen? Terribly sorry. Let me just go on and maybe address Carsten so that we have sort of boy, girl. And Carsten, your take on this sort of, and please no repetition, or just sort of say, this is exactly what I think, but what else needs to be done?
I think if you look from the debate we all know from our national context, I think climate policy is advancing now as it becomes tangible. What does it mean? Renewables, electromobility, moving to climate neutral production processes. So I think at the sector level, we have tangible narratives to tell and clear policies that are being discussed for the implementation. And I think for me, that is what will be needed for Glasgow as well, to become a lot more tangible. What does this transformation to climate neutrality mean? What are the commitments countries are engaging with for the next 5 to 10 years? And how can we support weaker countries in also going these pathways so no one is left behind? And I think for me, therefore, the 100 billion commitment that we have never clarified what kind of money that is, needs to be largely public money that will go to support weaker countries on that transformation, to allow them to also go the pathway, and will be very important for global solidarity. I think all the developing country partners we cooperate with, they are pointing out how desperate the situation in many of their contexts and many of the political situations is in their countries. In Europe, we are very much engaged with Corona recovery. In Germany, sometimes think of European perspective, but I think we've very much ignored so far in the level of public attention, the global dimension on this. And I think that is far more frightening. We are just closing our eyes from that part. And I think unless we address global solidarity, a just transformation, addressing Corona globally, I don't think we can even start to talk to emerging economies and poorer countries about climate policy. I think that's otherwise just not a fair basis to cooperate with. And I think that's why I think Glasgow will be very important in terms of really making clear what is it about and talking the bigger past messages. And I would like to challenge Karen, just to be a bit of here. I don't think it's about global carbon trading mechanisms and the specific elements at that moment. I think there we will have to look how they can tailor to address specific needs at the sector level. But
Can discuss that.
Thank you very much, Carsten. And I heard you loud and clearly. So we'll sort the problem out, which just means that I bring Catherine into the equation and into the dialogue. You're also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Roadmap Efficiency 2050 of the German Ministry for Energy and Economic Affairs. So what's your advice? What is necessary to be done within Germany and within the European context?
Well, I think it was nice. So Carsten's words were so nice to, wrap this whole package with the Corona and climate change and everything all put into one, and global solidarity. So it's hard to follow that act. So I'm glad you asked me a question that's specific to the German context and the European context. So I think, as all my colleagues have also made clear, we have some clear targets now. We, for many important players, have set targets of climate neutrality in 2050 or 2060. It's coming. The state is approaching fast, and I think that's important because going towards climate neutrality is something different than going towards reduced carbon emissions, and that's important because in the end of the day, you can reduce emissions a little bit by switching from coal to gas or doing other things, but that's not going to help us to achieve the climate neutrality goal in the long run. So we have to be very, very aware of path dependencies and so on. And that's important that that's being set straight, that the goal is carbon neutrality. I think that that's a good first step. But as Karen also said, we need to follow up with measures to achieve these goals. And I think in Germany, it's very clear that, we have an energy price system that is not at all compatible with the incentives that we want to set. Electricity is far too expensive for electrification of vehicles and of space heating. We need to change that. And we have made first steps now with the emissions pricing in Germany on transportation and space heating as well, but that also needs to scale up to the European level. So I think there are many things on the to-do list. It's not, so much a matter of what should we do? We don't know what to do. It's more a matter of getting down to business and getting it done. So I think that's the real challenge that we face.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sonia, I'm not quite sure whether we have already had questions that are relevant to our discussion right now. If there are, please just step in right now.
Yeah, actually, thank you very much. There's one first question in the Q&A, and I'm not sure who actually mentioned it. So the question is it a problem that China, as one big player, has set their own target of climate neutrality 10 years later than the others? And is this a wrong signal? And then the question, what should Germany and Europe do about it? I'm not sure. This is probably a question that a lot of you can answer. I don't know, is anybody who wants to go first? Maybe on this.
Yeah, I think both Carsten and Gabriel, because Gabriel was adamant about the fact that it's not just the US that counts, and but Carsten has raised his hand. So Carsten first, Gabriel second.
I think it's important that China stated their target is climate neutrality by 2060. We know China always is, since Copenhagen, less ambitious internationally where they commit to rather than what they do domestically. And I recall the conversations we had within Brussels, within the European Commission 2 or 3 years ago, where the question was whether for the long-term strategy we set the target for 2050 or 2060. So actually, that is not too long ago that we moved to 2050 at the European level. And I guess if you look at the climate objectives we have committed to in Paris, it's clear that industrial nations have to achieve climate neutrality far earlier than 2050. So it is a step, it's a way of looking at the future, and we have the ratcheting up process under the Paris Agreement, which will then gradually allow to better align the targets, the pathways with the climate necessities.
On the way to Gabriel, quick second question. Last week or 2 weeks ago, China sort of opened up a trading system for carbon within China, not internationally. What kind of role is that going to play?
Is this?
Oh, Gabriel, I don't mind. Whoever.
So I think it's a great signal that China is stepping up the game. I think the typical mechanism in China means that targets are announced, and then the political machinery tries to beat those targets. I think that's quite usual. That's how it works. And so I'm very optimistic that the 260 will is not just feasible, but that efforts will be commensurate to that objective, and probably even more than that. And the fact that the Chinese get serious about their own emission trading system shows that they equip themselves with the instruments. And cap and trade is the right thing to do, with the possibility then to fine tune as they see the scope for it, to fine tune the ambition of the emission savings scheme. So I think that's all great, and it's also clear that without China, there is no way that we can tackle the global climate emergency. And without China really being in the game, there is also a much bigger reluctance elsewhere. In the big trading partners of China in the region, Indonesia, India, and so on, or in the United States, where the China threat was always a super important element in the discussion. I mean, remember when the United States withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol? That China played a super important role in that discussion. So with China now being more active and more ambitious, I think the international equilibrium of the game changes fundamentally to the better. I think that cannot be underestimated. And then whether we talk about 2060 officially or 2050, whether some targets are intensities, carbon per GDP, or whether they are in absolute, tons, all that I think is just of secondary importance.
Lovely, thank you so much. And can I just sort of take the conversation to Catherine and Karen again, and maybe bring in again the American card, and what does being back in the dialogue mean for Europe? I mean, Catherine, you probably have looked in many aspects at the Green Deal, Karen as well, and the German contribution in it, of course. So is it relevant? And if so, how relevant is it that America is, at least as we said, verbally back on track, wanting to host the Earth Day, wanting to get more commitments by international leaders on climate issues? Is that going to not just support Europeans in their strive, but is it also going to make a difference to European policy, to the reality on the ground? Maybe Catherine, you start, and then Karen takes over when Catherine finishes, please.
Okay, so thank you. I think, to be honest, I think that the US being back, I think it's in a way a little bit of an overstatement. So Trump left, that's true, but in many things that happened in the US also happened at the level of the state, and many states, they continued their efforts to decarbonize. So I think, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that now it's a huge game changer. Also, Biden will have a hard time implementing some things like carbon pricing, for instance. It's going to be a real challenge. I don't think it's likely that he'll succeed at that. But of course, it's the symbolic value is there. And I think it's important that the US steps up and takes part, especially in convincing other countries across the globe that they should also contribute to their part of the package. So if the US were to just step away from all responsibility, that's really hard then to convince other countries that are poorer that they should carry a part of the burden. But I think it's nice that he's back. It's nice that the US is back, but climate change is not something that the US is going to take the lead in solving for the rest of the world. I think everyone has to play a part.
Karen, what's your take?
Let me just start with just adding a little bit to the thing that we discussed before. I thought it really fascinating that in this case, basically bad US intentions led to fairly good consequences, because I think it can be argued that the very skeptical standpoint of the US regarding climate policy during the last years was actually one motivating factor for China to actually step up and show we are better than that. And that in turn, then now, of course, they have this goal, and that allows the US easier to have it easier to also step up their goals. So in the end, it turned out to be quite well in that respect. Regarding the US, the value of the US being back, I agree with Catherine that I don't think there is, for example, a chance that Joe Biden will be able to implement a federal carbon pricing system. I mean, there's a lot of skepticism in the US about federal policies. And the question is to which extent is that really a big problem? I mean, we do see carbon pricing in a number of states already in the US. I assume there will be more in the future. We see other types of policies on a federal level, on a state level. For Europe, one problem with this could be if there is a carbon border adjustment mechanism actually coming, how do you take this into account? If you have a very heterogeneous landscape with respect to different regulation in the US, and I think that can be a challenge, especially if there is supposed to be cooperation among the different, among the US and the EU in this respect.
Yes, Connie, I don't know. I just, there's a lot of action going on in the Q&A and in the comments. Thank you very much for this. By the way, I do see your names. You don't have to type them in your questions. I just decided, since I also group questions, not to mention names. I hope that's okay. So I would like to group 3 questions actually that I got in the Q&A and bring them from the panel. And they are all concerned in some way or another about how do we actually have to set up institutions to do successful international climate policy. So somebody asked, how do we bring everybody on the table? So what does this table actually mean? Then another person hinted at that what's about the sovereignty in this context of international negotiations. She gave the example that China just invested heavily into coal in Pakistan. So how do you deal with this, with sovereign nations being part of these international negotiations? And then there was a third question asking, like, how would you imagine the design of climate policy would look like 50 years ahead from now, which also kind of links to this question, how do we want to set up institutions? And I think maybe this whole package of questions is could be addressed together.
And maybe Carsten can kick off, because one of the quotes was actually addressed to him, and then we played from there. Is that okay?
Okay, sure. I think the final question is a good starting point. I don't have a clue what climate policies will look like in 50 years. I think economics and policies are inherently a function of our societies and social context, and I think they will change over the next decades. So I think we can look at what are effective policies today and what is a vision that is sufficient for investors, for our country, our territory. And all the partners we work with in other countries, they have other discussions in their national context, what would be suitable policies for guiding that transformation. So I think this national sovereignty is essential. And I think that is, for me, the core essence of the Paris Agreement, that countries take responsibility in designing their policies and implementing these policies. And I think that is then, in a way, also determining a bit how we need to work internationally. I think at the end, it is only from a national discourse that you can actually implement successful policies. And then I think the question is how we can define interfaces that allow countries that are less endowed with economic wealth at this moment to kind of get some support to kind of implementing policies in areas where that is needed. And my sense is that we have a lot of least developed countries where it is perhaps something where international development agencies can work effectively. But if you look at, for example, the Indian solar strategy or other bigger picture lighthouse projects, I think there are tailored cooperations needed. And I think that is quite suitable for bilateral cooperations with a set of smaller countries on both sides that work together to tailor this cooperation. And I think that's why I don't see this table anymore as a big table where we come together to negotiate. It is a table where we come together to report what we are doing, to kind of look to each other to say, where do we want to go together? But at the end, it's a lot of national processes that are essential for the success of achieving the climate objectives.
Connie seems to be gone for a moment. So I don't know, any thoughts from the other three of you? If you give me any hints. Karen, you have something. Great.
Yeah, I have something short, basically. I'm adding to what Carsten said. I have a little bit of a different take on climate policy in 50 years. That would make it 2070. And I would very much hope that we don't need it anymore at that point in time. I mean, we, at least not with respect to reducing emissions, maybe with respect to negative emissions, in order to actually, if we overshoot the target, get back to the 1.5 or 2 degree line. So that is basically implicit in what we are discussing at the moment. And I do hope as well that if that happened, also fossil technologies, so energy technologies, other types of technologies that are based on the usage of fossil fuels will just not be competitive anymore. That we basically have the mirror image of the discussion that we have today. At the moment, we have to kind of get the transformation going in the sense that we have the renewable energies, that we have a circular economy, and so on. And by that point in time, if the system has completely changed, then hopefully it will not be valuable to invest again in structures that actually need fossil technologies. So perhaps this on the 250 question, which is probably the most attractive one, as it kind of lets your fantasy get going. With respect to the sovereignty question, I mean, we do have a bottom-up system with respect to climate policy. So we cannot tell somebody not to invest in another country. Of course, then it's up to Pakistan. In this case, for example, on the one hand, do we allow this type of investment or not? There can be some naming and shaming. Whether that has any effect, we'll see. But of course, it's also to some extent the task of the rest of the world to provide opportunities, to provide alternatives to countries that actually need the inflow of investment. And if nobody is willing to invest and nobody is willing to support, especially developing countries or countries in an economic crisis following, for example, COVID, then the money that is offered will be taken. And in this case, it might be invested in fossil technologies.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sonja, and I see Gabriel, and finally I've heard Karen as well with the answer, so very, very happy. Sorry about sort of having to deal with the systems behind it. Gabriel, you wanted to answer on that. I just wanted to expand when we look at the recovery packages to which we will migrate in our discussion sort of in the next bit, we can see that a lot is green, but that projects, especially in Asia, that had already been cancelled, that were investing in coal, have now gotten sort of a new chance that are being looked at again. So COVID-19 and recovery seems to have sort of shifted the balance from a pathway that had already been laid out before back to a step before. Is that a threat that we're facing? And Gabriel, say what you wanted to say in the first place, please, as well.
Okay, thank you, Connie. So I think what Karen said is clearly very important. You know, when we think about how 2050 looks like, it must be a situation where countries, companies around the world find it optimal from, you know, out of their own impetus not to emit any carbon emissions anymore. And that tells us how crucial technology is. And if we start with that, you know, with this idea for 2050, then the question is, what does it mean for us today? No, and the centrality of technology, I think, it becomes very obvious when we talk about the problem that way. Now, what is then the role for Germany, the EU, the United States, China, the big economic powers in the world? No, it is probably to do what they can to quicken the research and development necessary to bring the technologies forward. I think that is something we do not do enough at the global scale. I think it is important to talk about emission pricing and, you know, to coordinate efforts globally. All that is important, but you know, cooperation in the area of technology is probably more important than that. And it's dangerous that, you know, we turn the race for carbon-free technologies into national industry policy agendas, where at the end the idea is how we can develop for Germany, or for the United States, or for China, you know, cheap or efficient sources of energy that at the same time do save on emissions, fine, but on the other hand, foster something like a competitive advantage for their own economy. That is a zero-sum mindset that will not lead to success, and it will be very difficult to bring, as one of the persons in the chat said, bring everyone to the table, in particular the poorer countries. We need to, you know, a subsidies race or a technology race that is driven by the nations in a sort of competition is harmful, and therefore we need to be coordinating on that. I think that is super important. And then the question that you asked, Connie, on whether the Corona crisis makes us look back. So I think you know, the political process is never such that a decision is taken and then it is followed up, you know, without any backs and forths. So I think this is natural, and in particular if countries are hit by a shock like the Corona shock, you know, where there is, you know, some sort of desperation, and what can we do quickly? You know, what is worked out? What are investment plans that are ready to be implemented? Now, I think the good news is, in particular in the Asian space, that the Corona crisis is, I wouldn't say over, but the most dramatic consequences are now being digested already. So the economies are coming back, and that's why I think that this brief lapse back probably is just a brief lapse back. And we see it on the energy markets. The appeal of cheap resources is over. The prices are going up. So for whatever reason, that's an interesting discussion. But that means that this short-term window of opportunity to look back and say, oh, we can have quick gains by going dirty again. I think that's closed again. So I'm not overly worried about that. Now the Pakistan question and these problems, just tell us it's not China. No, this is not about China. Anyone else would, I think, if there's an interesting investment opportunity in whatever technology in Pakistan, if the return is there, investors will be coming, right, from wherever. You cannot even exclude European money going there through, it's not much control we have over that. There's cascading models of investment. So I think that just tells us that we need to bring these big economies, in Pakistan is a big economy in terms of people count. No, we need to bring them into the equation. Yeah.
So that was a very long answer, and maybe I see Karen raising her finger. I finally see her. Yes, you're going to be next. So please, you chip in. And after that, we really want to go back to the recovery packages, both international and then. But first of all, Karen, please.
A very short reaction to Gabriel, and I can't believe that I'm probably arguing more for markets than he does, which is weird, but perhaps I misunderstood him. Just regarding technology development, I do believe that there should be some aspect of competition between, especially companies, but probably also on a national level to some extent, because this competition actually drives the technological developments, and there has to be some profit opportunities in that. I mean, there is a tightrope also with respect to, if you compare it to projects where we really have this kind of international approach, and I'm just thinking of the fusion reactor, for example, which is built in France, which is taking forever because it needs coordination. The institutions are set up in a way that are really inefficient. So you need to kind of combine, on the one hand, having competition and having this kind of, not race, but strive for better technologies. And on the other hand, you need, obviously, some degree of international cooperation. And I think that's also something that can be discussed in Glasgow regarding the mechanisms with which to actually get these technologies also into other countries. And that's on the one hand private investment, but that's on the other hand also rules and regulations with respect to technology disbursement, if you want to call it that. It was a very short answer.
No,
addition.
it was. I'm completely happy with that.
Okay.
And I know that Sonia has probably already sort of looked at some of the questions. Are any of them sort of right now relevant, or can we proceed to the next question about the sort of inverted commas greening or brown aspects of recovery packages? Sonia?
Well, there is some more questions. I don't know if we look also a bit on time. Maybe I group two together and then maybe leave some more for the rest. There's two questions actually on the question of leaving no one behind, kind of as a keyword. So addressing developing and emerging countries, and a related question if climate policy can kind of as a co-benefit also address social inequalities in developing countries, and if yes, how? So I would see this as a broad complex of addressing climate policy in mostly developing emerging countries, but maybe also accounting for the social implications in all countries. And then I think you should move on to the next part on green recovery, and I will see if I place some more questions in the end.
Lovely. And I think Carsten first, but Catherine, I would also see as an answer or as an answerer to this question, simply because, of course, also in the Green Deal, we have the saying, we want to leave no one behind. So the transfer within Europe is supposed to be socially accepted as well. So maybe that's the take I'd like you to look at. Carsten, please.
Mm-hmm. I think let's get specific. If we, for example, look at basic materials, that's a quarter of global CO2 emissions is from the production of steel, cement, aluminium, and these basic production processes. If we go to climate neutrality, we can shift these processes to electricity-based processes or hydrogen-based processes, but it takes a lot of energy and a lot of renewable energy in the long term. And so access to this renewable energy at that volume is difficult in Europe as much as in many Asian countries. So I think the transformation to climate neutrality implies that we will also emphasize a lot more resource efficiency, material efficiency, recycling, such that we don't need to make as much primary material from new each time. If we do this, this implies today's primary production capacities, for example, in Europe, of steel or other basic materials, will no longer be needed at that volume. And that creates an interesting dynamic, interesting for an economist from the outside looking at it. The first installations will shift to clean processes, and who wasn't fast enough will have to close down the steel plant. And I think that's where, for me, this leave no one behind comes to play. We have to make sure that across Europe in the industrial region, we maintain some climate neutral steel plants. And that means, and I think that's a motivation also for a lot of European countries to be constructive in terms of making sure also they are participating in this transformation, such that they can early enough change to the new technologies and therefore retain their industrial activities. And I think that's, for me, the meaning of leaving no one behind at the European example, but I guess you can look at it at different sectors and in different countries and contexts as well. Secondly, to make this a social transition, just transition, I think, again, having this national sovereignty is essential. I think if you look at our German context, we rarely ever implement policies purely for climate policy objectives. But there's a lot of other narratives that come with it: local jobs, employment, whatever it might be in terms of local air pollution or other preferences from local companies. And giving countries the space to develop their own policies means, and their agenda, that they will automatically also look for what are the solutions that have political backing in their country and will therefore address multiple of the objectives at the same time. And I think that's where giving power to governments to kind of design the relevant policy framework for this transition is also an important element of making it a just transition.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes, thank you. So just to add a little bit to what Carsten said, I think it's important to think of policy packages, because it's hard to fix everything with a single policy tool. It's basically impossible. I think most economists would agree. So what we need to do is, when we do something like we implement carbon pricing, then we need to think about what are the distributionary impacts of this and how can we correct for them? How can we make those that suffer the most, or poor households, for instance, who have higher heating costs in terms of their share of their income that they spend on it, how can we compensate them so that they are not in the end carrying most of the bill? I think that's an important thing, and that's going to be, as Carsten said, different in every country. What exactly is the institutional design? How do things trickle down, so to speak? So I think for sure that's something that we need to keep in mind. But I think it is important also for the general acceptance that we have this big picture, that there are multiple narratives, right? Because otherwise people are likely to feel left behind, and that's exactly what we want to avoid. So to get enough of a political support for an instrument, you really need to think everything in there. And it's easier to see in some types of policy tools like carbon pricing or taxes and so on, it's easier to see the costs. Whereas in terms of if you introduce standards or other kinds of command and control, the costs are there. There is an implicit carbon price, which might be very high, but it's not easy to see. And that often means that that part of the story is forgotten. It's like people don't have it as present in their mind because they don't see the bill presented in front of them. And that means that in many cases, these costs are they're kind of forgotten. And I think that's a challenge, especially in countries where you cannot implement carbon pricing. So where you have to rely on standards and command and control, I think the challenge there to make sure that the distributional consequences are not too dire, I think that's really hard. So it's another reason why economists, are typically in favor of these market-based tools, because they just make life easier also for the policymakers in the longer run. Maybe not in the short run, but in the longer run.
Thank you, Catherine. And let me just have a quick outlook on timing. We have 40 minutes left until 11 o'clock. So I really would like to spend, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes on the recovery packages that we're seeing all around the world, but of course also here at home. I'd like to start with Karen, because she's been an advocate right from the start of saying, yes, when we do recovery packages, we really need to have a lot of green in it in order to set the right pathway for the next couple of years. And of course, we all know that Germany is part and parcel of the 55% European ambition. And from 20 onwards, 2011 onwards, I would really like to look at the means by which we can actually reach it, technology, and then sort of come to a wrap up on what's the best policy strategy. So let's kick off with Karen. As far as recovery packages are concerned, you demanded it. Well, I mean, you put forward a couple of points. How much do you feel our present German recovery packages actually reflecting that? Or is it like, maybe we go a little bit green, but we will serve the brown economy still?
Let me start with a general justification, because I think that's behind that. If you want to have it for Germany, then you should have a reason why you actually want that, also for the EU. And for me, there's basically three main reasons. I think three, yes. On the one hand, if I spend, for example, which is a typical thing to spend money on of recovery packages in crisis on infrastructure, then I should use it on infrastructure that's actually compatible with the long-term development. Infrastructure is by nature long-term. And since we are going for decarbonization, you should go for the green infrastructure, or at least infrastructure that is compatible with that. The second reason is if I'm spending now money, which is tight, obviously, on especially long-term investments in, for example, industries like steel, like chemistry, like cement, where you sometimes have investment needs or reinvestment needs up to 60% in the next 10 years, you should better go for technologies that also have this long-term decarbonization perspective. If I use those technologies for 30 to 40 years, that actually reaches until 2050, so to climate neutrality. So ignoring that, ignoring the risk that actually climate policy poses for these investments. If I do it in the wrong area, they might not be competitive in the long run. It's also, from an economic perspective, a very smart thing to do, to take that into account and to actually foster investment in those technologies that are compatible with that in the long run. Otherwise, I run the risk of creating a lot of stranded assets or not reaching my target goals or giving them up in the medium term. And the third aspect that is usually also part of recovery programs, and that's also part of the German recovery program, is investment in new technologies. So basically also getting things going. I find it a little bit misplaced perhaps to talk of recovery in that sense, because it's not creating a lot of jobs from the outset. It's not really creating a lot of revenue. It's really investment in the long term. But it's often part of recovery packages. So for these reasons, I think that there should be a substantial green component, at least green thinking, in the recovery programs. So if I look at the German one, it's the mixed bag. I mean, there's on the one hand, of course, the rescue parts of the program, which, in order to avoid basically not manageable structural change and avoid mass unemployment, for example, you have to be relatively neutral with respect to pure rescue. With respect to recovery, we do have some aspects of all three components that I mentioned, but what I find especially missing, and that holds for many of the recovery programs in the present and also in the past, is the recognition or the taking account of the fact that whatever's money you spend now will only be a one-time effect if you don't change the framework in which this investment takes place. So at the same time, while pouring money into certain activities, acknowledging that the time horizon of companies is often not 30 to 40 years in the sense that they anticipate carbon prices, etc. At the same time, you should set up these carbon pricing schemes. You should set up the framework conditions that you need to actually steer the economy in a green direction. And then you will also need less money from state side or public money in order to get the investment in the right direction. If you don't do that, then you will have a short-term effect, companies taking advantage of whatever you give them. In the worst case effect, you even have basically crowding out. So you take some money that you wanted to invest anyway in green investment and rather put it in, for example, brown investment. And then you basically dilute the entire effect. So you need to get the framework straight. And as we have already heard today, for example, in Germany, the carbon price that we just introduced, that we basically set at 25 euros with the expectation that that would match the European carbon price, is already too low. I mean, the European carbon price was a couple of days ago was 38. I'm not quite sure where it is now, and it might fall again. I mean, given that. But we're still at a level which is far too low in order to reach actually the updated climate targets.
Well, thank you very much for that long explanation, but I did
Sorry.
have one question to you. For the next three answers, please, a bit briefer. But Gabriel, I saw that you were shaking your head at one point. If you still remember what you were shaking your head about, please share that with us.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. I think Karen irritated me at some point in her speech, but then at the end she made up for it again, because what I wanted to say is that it is indeed the market signals that matter, and then she was very clear about that. So I'm thankful for this clarification. It's not a question of money. We have liquidity all over the place. Companies are awash with cash. No, it's not that we need, Olaf Scholz give them more billions of euros, which they would then cash out to their shareholders. We need them to really invest, and that's why incentives.
Do you not have to? I'm sorry. Do you not have to differentiate between big companies and small companies? I'm quite sure that a number of small-scale companies everywhere are really sort of suffering right at the moment.
Well, yes, of course, the Corona crisis puts a lot of strain on many balance sheets, in particular small companies. That is very clear. But the available liquidity, the costs of credit, the cost of money is super low. It is super low, and you listen carefully to our central bankers. It will remain low, and it will particularly remain low to create an environment where green investment can take place. And so, I think we do not need billions and billions of additional taxpayer money. We need to make sure that the savings that are there, that are plentiful, we are living in a savings club. There's too much of it, private savings, that they go into those places where it makes sense, and that's where regulation comes, and where pricing signals come in. And so I think that's super important, to get that clear. And I think we are on one page there, Karen and I. But during her speech, I was a little bit uncertain because it does not need. You don't need to put. We need to activate private investment. I think that is far more important and also more useful, because the danger that misinvestment takes place, we are no better. We as experts are no better in seeing what the future in 2050 is than companies. We are probably worse, and that's why.
I mean, you need to take the time. You need to take the time horizon into account. Not all investment think about what is happening in 20 or 30 years. They think about short-term returns, and there it gets more tricky than this seems to suggest.
So that's a different discussion, I think, but I'd not be so sure about that. And also, I mean, if you look at those companies that are around for hundreds of years now, GE, BASF, for example, that's not so clear. It's a cheap point to say, oh, you care just for the next quarters, and me as a politician who gets voted out of office tomorrow, has a longer time horizon. I think that's on very shaky grounds, actually.
No, I mean, let's admit it, both extremes are on shaky grounds and are easy to make. We're somewhere in the middle, having both actually present.
I'm actually very happy that it's not all harmony here on the panel. So thank you very much for the controversy, because of course that way even those that you are advising have to make up their mind in the end what's best. And of course politicians in the end will do what's good and what's sellable. So but we're not going to go into that discussion right now. Maybe a very short replique from Carsten and Catherine if they want to, and then please, Sonia, share with us what's going on in the chat. Carsten?
I think I would differentiate also in the recovery package discussion between Germany and Europe. I think we are fiscally and on the private company side in a very much different sitting in Germany as many other European countries are. And I think that's where the European Recovery and Resilience Facility comes in to have a very powerful element. I think we've looked at the past in terms of how EU structural funds have been allocated. Member states had to identify priority accesses and say, what do they want to do with the money? It was their autonomy to decide what to do with the money, as long as they showed how it would contribute towards achieving the European policy objectives, innovation, jobs, or whatever it was at the time. And in the 750 billion European facility, we've now a requirement that 30% of the money, plus minus in the different funds, has to be allocated to greening the economy. And I think this can be a really powerful instrument, because what we've seen in the past is that obviously you use European money and complement this with national money. But you only have a certain level of flexibility in terms of what you can do nationally. So the European money actually, even in German states, had a huge guiding impact on what priorities states within Germany took when they were using European money. And so I think this greening component of the European budget can have a really important element of helping local authorities and countries to kind of implement measures that achieve these long-term objectives. And I think from this perspective, the point that Karen made at the beginning is important, to really see, does it make sense to invest in green stuff now? And I think it does make from a recovery perspective. If you look at the 3 T's, timely, targeted, and temporary. Timely in the way that we have now a debate of more than a decade of what are the measures that need to be implemented. Targeted, so they're well prepared. A lot of stuff is shovel ready to a large extent. Targeted, we've discussed that many of the things have not happened in the past because the policy framework was not there, or the initial incremental costs were not addressed. So if you spend some additional public funding, together with a big emphasis, and I fully share Gabriel and Karin's point there, of public policy, I think it can really lead to additional economic activities towards the transformation. And temporary, I think it is kickstarting a lot of the developments that we are looking for. And once there is more momentum behind this, there are more actors pushing for a stronger, better policy framework because they are starting to make money in these business areas. I think then the public policy does all the trick, and we don't need to spend any more public money on these areas. So I think dependent on the specific sector, there is a role also of public funding, and depending on the European countries, there might be a bigger role than it might currently be the space in Germany.
Thank you very much, Catherine. If possible, a tad shorter than Carsten.
I don't have much to add. I think my colleagues have made, the relevant points. So I think in the beginning of the crisis, I think many of us were nervous that this would mean that we put a brake on climate policy. And fortunately, that's not the case. So I think, I'm optimistic about the outcome.
Yeah, I think also yesterday when we were in a very different conference talking about perception, talking about information, the bottom line is climate policy has not fallen behind in public awareness. And that I think on the whole is a very good message. We just need to build on it and need to keep up the momentum. I'm very sure, Sonia, there will be 1 or 2 questions that we can slot in right now. And then we will proceed to the means by which we can achieve it outside of policy, and those are technologies. So, Sonia, maybe now something about the green or brown recovery? Have you muted yourself by any chance?
Might be the case. Sorry for that. Do you hear me again?
That's
Great.
okay.
has to happen at each conference at least once. There's actually two questions on the green recovery programs which fit well. One is more of a comment. There's some skepticism that planning and reality might diverge. So some observation that already in the recovery program from 2010 there was green investment was prioritized, but then what we saw then and what it actually did is not what was intended. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then the second question is again addressing the question of inequality. So there is the question or the observation or the hypothesis that it takes a long time to evaluate if specific measures lead to social inequalities, which I'm not so sure if this is actually the case. But I mean, also more broadly, the question would be how can one ensure that these recovery questions also take into account social inequalities.
Any first takers? Hands up, please. I'm always worried to ask Gabriel because she's always taking sort of 5 minutes. So no, Gabriel, please, but briefly.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief. So I think on inequality, what is crucial is that we keep a lid on energy price everywhere, right? I think if we want to be successful with this agenda, then it cannot just be carbon prices. It also it needs to be access to affordable clean power within Germany, within Europe, and more importantly, even in developing countries. That's one thing. The other thing I wanted to say is that not doing anything about climate change poses the much bigger inequality problems, right? Because all we know, at least that's the evidence I know, is that unabated climate change will hit the poorest most everywhere, internationally and domestically. And so by having a proactive agenda, we are already engaged in fighting a surge in inequality. We shouldn't forget that. This may not be enough, but it's probably the most important part of the solution already.
Thank you, Karen.
Just adding to that a little bit. I mean, the one thing about carbon pricing that's also adding to what Catherine said before, it's very visible where the costs arise. So it's much easier to actually get a handle on the effects of carbon pricing on the income distribution. If you have lots of diverse small policies, that's much harder. Regarding internationally, perhaps also come into that, I think we shouldn't worry that much about the distributional effects within developing countries, for example, of a carbon tax. I mean, in many respects, or in some respects, it has been shown that they're actually progressive in these countries. But the problem there is much more that the income level is really low. So even if you don't take that much away from poor people, it can be still too much, even if rich people are suffering more. So I think with respect to international, it's less the distributional effects within country, for example, from carbon pricing, but more of the international effects via trading, via production, outsourcing, etc., that they're much more important and that might be harder to assess.
And that leaves me to ask Catherine, following on from your statement, of course, we have the issue of carbon leakage, or the question about carbon leakage, as Karen was just saying, in trading, looking at supply chains, looking at distribution of production, and some of the decisions may not have been all that well taken in the past on the European level, as far as that's concerned.
Well, I think if we look at the flagship policy tools, so the EU ETS, the evidence on carbon leakage resulting from that is actually not that strong. It doesn't seem to have had that big of an impact. This may, of course, have to do with the low prices, right? So in the future, it might be a different story. That's very hard to say. So we're all, as economists, we're happy to see the price rising for several reasons, but one of them is that it's going to be easier to tickle out impacts from the statistical analysis. But of course, no, I think there is a lot of research on this, and of course, it's an important policy question. And we're looking at this both at the international level and trying to get better data, because in many cases actually the data is not really there to do these types of studies. I know that the people in Kiel have made a lot of efforts into improving the databases for the future research, so we're grateful for that, collaborating with the German statistical offices to put new data sets together that will allow us to assess these issues better. But in general, I think that the problem of leakage remains real. So whether or not we can find evidence of it, it certainly plays a role in the policy discussion. And so we have to take it seriously. And I think it's going to be hard to convince policymakers and workers associations and industrial associations as well that there is no issue here, because I think it's clear that there is a threat that has to be taken seriously. So.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And Carsten was wanting to get in, and I would have said 1 minute carte blanche.
I think the carbon leakage part is really only an issue for basic materials. That is where carbon cost increases a lot compared to the value added, and where we have globally traded commodities behind that. And I think that's where in the past, yes, with free allocation, we addressed carbon leakage concerns and had the continued issue that then the carbon costs are not addressed, reflected in the value chain. So basic materials don't get much more expensive, and we don't have all the incentives we need for material substitution, efficient material use. And the final consumers don't at the end pay for the incremental costs which we need to finance the clean technologies. And I think that's where the French initiative on CBAMs that is now reflected at the European level has been very welcome, to say we have to structurally address this conflict that is in the discussion right now. On the one hand, carbon leakage protection, increase the level of free allocation. On the other hand, effective carbon price signal, reduce the level of free allocation. So we used one instrument to achieve two objectives, and that has been not possible, very effective for basic materials so far. And I think that's where one of our favorite options could be to say we continue with the free allocation to address the carbon leakage, but then implement a climate contribution, a charge per ton of basic material at the level of the free allocation that is levied whenever these materials are sold to the European consumers. And that means you have, on the one hand, effective carbon leakage protection, and on the other hand, all the consistent carbon price. We have no longer this conflicting interest, and we have a consistent way that allows us to operate in a system with higher carbon pricing levels, and therefore address this concern and really get on with the Green Deal.
Lovely, thank you so much. And that leaves me to sort of, drive on our discussion to the last part. And as a caveat for everything, as a precondition for everything, we're talking about technologies, A, being available, B, being mass produced, being mass available. That's the point, right? At the moment, a couple of technologies are only there. Then there's a new kid on the block. Everybody is talking about hydrogen. Question is it green? Is it brown? How green is it? Is it produced in Germany, in Europe? Does it have to be shipped? So we have a lot of constellations that we need to talk about, and we only have 15 minutes left for that. I believe, Catherine, you are actually doing a study on hydrogen and in comparison to Australia. Or was that Karen? Sorry.
It must be Karen.
So I'm sorry. I'm no longer looking at my papers. I'm just so fascinated by the discussion. So, Karen, I believe you told me when we had a chat beforehand that you're actually looking at this sort of Australia-European connection. How come?
Let's put it like that. It's not me doing that. I'm part of a project that's financed by the German Federal Ministry of Economics that actually looks at the potentials of hydrogen import from Australia. So basically trying, and I think that is the really important part, trying to look at all steps of the progress. How much supply can reasonably be, under which circumstances be expected, what demand can be expected in Germany, how expensive are actually the trading costs, how does the legal framework have to look. And it seems kind of weird, like choosing Australia for that, but of course Australia has a huge outback where you can actually harvest a lot of green electricity and actually proceed to make hydrogen out of it. And we're also importing coal from Australia, at least to some extent. So why not hydrogen? So it's one study. It's not the only study that actually is conducted with respect to importing hydrogen from other countries, because at least the estimates, as they suggest that we will not be able to produce all the hydrogen that might be actually demanded in the future within Germany. So we would need a lot more renewable energy to reproduce from that, and just from the basically peak times where we have too much renewables, that would not be enough, and would also not be competitive. Wouldn't be profitable to just do it from that. So we are in that project. We are in the beginning, and we're looking very much forward. But there's a lot of interest, and I think that shows also the global development from the Australian side as well as from the German side. And perhaps as a background story, we were also with a delegation in Japan a couple of years back. And of course, hydrogen is a technology that has been pushed far longer in Japan than it has been, for example, in Europe. And Japan was looking towards Australia to import, at that time, hydrogen, which was produced from coal energy generation, coal combined with CCS. And when we were in Australia on the delegation, that was to some extent still the basic mindset, and that has changed dramatically over the last 2-3 years towards the green notion. So basically production from renewables. So I think there's a lot of dynamic in the development, but it's of utmost importance to not make, to some extent, the same mistake that we have done in the past with respect to renewable energy expansion, for example, just looking at putting as much as possible out there, but kind of neglecting for a while the systemic view on things, that we also need other stuff, like grids, for example. And so I think there is going in the right direction, but that is a very uncertain field still.
Okay, let me sort of reverberate that idea with everybody else. The new kid on the block, hydrogen, very sexy. Right as we're talking, there's another conference going on, also in Berlin, of course, also digital, on hydrogen. You have the head of the chief economist of the International Energy Organization talking about hydrogen being it. It is part of the mix of energy for the future. You have the head of IRENA saying, yes, we need to put money into the development. What's your take, Gabriel?
So, two aspects. So first of all, I think whenever specific technologies are targeted explicitly, and they seem to be the only big topic now in the discussions, economists become a little bit skeptical. No, so we want technologically neutral solutions. Having said that, I find hydrogen alluring for many reasons. One is it is a general purpose thing, right? It can be used in many different applications. We have Airbus around here in the north of Germany, and the aircraft of the future will probably have to rely on hydrogen. They're very clear about that. We have the application
from 2035.
Yes, so that's true. That's true. But again, let us challenge them. No, and they should be able to beat those expectations if the framework is the right one. But so it's a general purpose technology with many applications. That makes it interesting. The second thing is hydrogen is relatively easily tradable. Now, Karen in her project will tell us how large the trade costs are, but it is relatively cheap to be traded. I had a conversation with the Australian ambassador a couple of weeks ago, and the point is that once you got the stuff on the ship, the distance doesn't matter anymore. So if we transport it from Morocco to Rotterdam or Hamburg, or from Perth in Australia, it doesn't really matter much, because putting it on the ship and then getting it back, that is the costly thing. And it has a big possible development component to it as well. It's not so much relevant for Australia, but if we look at the European neighborhoods, Northern Africa, that could be a boon for their development and bring them on the table. We started with the question, how do we, globalize climate policies? And, it needs to be a package. I think Catherine said so, and that's clear. And also the development, development issue needs to be there, and hydrogen could play an important role there. So I'm positive about it. What we need to do in terms of policies is to make sure that we are able to do experimental large-scale trials, and that, of the scale of CERN, I would say. CERN, the research lab near the Geneva, is a €1 billion project. So here we need to put public money on the table, not to roll the technology out, but to help the businesses scale it and show its feasibility.
For you, Carsten and Catherine, I'm going to turn the question. What if not hydrogen? What else are we looking at? Again, yesterday in a conference, it was said, right at the moment, we already, until 2050, we already have a gap of 70% as far as technologies are concerned. Right at the moment, the technologies that are on the table cover probably 30% of what is needed by then, and also of the technological development. So what else but hydrogen? Maybe Carsten first, he's grinning. Unmute.
Catherine, Anders, ladies first.
Yeah, ladies first.
Thank you, Carsten.
Sorry, I didn't want to take it. So let me go. I think, first of all, yes, some hydrogen might be helpful in the future as imports. I think we have pipeline systems that we currently use to import natural gas that could be used also for hydrogen. That saves us a lot on the transformation of hydrogen liquefaction afterwards. Because one of my concerns is why not so much hydrogen? It is ultimately pretty resource intensive to create all the energy and to transfer all the hydrogen from somewhere in the rest of the world. And yes, it could be a development aspect, but we also know about the challenges that resource extraction can impose for poor countries if it's centralized technologies like hydrogen, I think, would be in these countries as well. So it's not necessarily clear that it will be to the benefit of all countries participating. And that's why I think a lot of work is necessary on the demand side. I think if you would have discussed 20 years ago, how much will lighting change, how much electricity we need now to kind of make our house bright. It's a fraction of what we thought 20 years ago. And I think in many demand side applications, we can do a lot. And I think that helps on the need for imports of hydrogen as much as on various other resource and environmental objectives. And I think that is somehow an element I'm somewhat worried about, that the hydrogen debate often is seen as a solution that avoids us to kind of get into the more nitty-gritty details of resource efficiency, material efficiency, energy efficiency. Finally, I think if you go towards Eastern European partner countries, there's a lot of biomass, for example. So I think we can also think more of biogas. I think France is far stronger on biogas. They use biogas for high-value applications for which we need gas. In Germany, we use biogas to kind of for local power generation, which is not really very valuable in the way it is done right now. So I think as well there we have opportunities for other energy carriers. And yes, I think we need to support hydrogen at this moment to kind of find out what it can do, but have to make sure that we see it as one part of the mix of energy carriers that is helpful for the future.
Okay, Carsten had already given you the word, so Catherine, now take it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with most everything that's been said, I think, so far. But I think I would like to get back to what Gabriel said, that picking one technology is really something that economists typically are not big fans of, and I think it's important here to keep in mind. For instance, what did we do when we needed a new vaccine for COVID? We put money in a lot of different technologies to develop vaccines, and the one that came out on top was the first of its kind, right? That's broadly licensed, the mRNA vaccine for human use. So I think we don't know what's going to be the best choice. I think that's the key message, and we need to put money in different alternatives. So not only hydrogen, but maybe also carbon capture and storage techniques, if we're not going to be able to get rid of all the carbon, all the fossil fuels. So that's an important thing. But I also think, I'm not going to say that I know the solution, because I'm an economist. I'm not an engineer, and I don't do much of that type of research. So I think another thing that's really important is not forgetting the the solutions that are already at hand. So I think we need to do more to push electrification. That's really, there's a lot of potential there that we have not at all realized. And I think hydrogen should close the gaps or be a contribution to closing the gaps. But we should, get to where the gaps are first. And we're far away from there. We have not at all done what we could do. So I think I'm a little bit worried that because hydrogen is so sexy and everyone wants to bring the new technology on the market, people are going to forget about the one that's already there because it's just not as sexy. So that's my concern.
Thank you. I see Carsten wanting to get in one more time, if I have not misinterpreted your body language.
Yes, I think fully backing up Catherine's point, I think hydrogen has the big challenge that you lose half the energy by turning into hydrogen, and the other half if you transform it back to electricity, which are most of our energy applications nowadays. So that is just a huge gap of energy, and Karen will tell us then more about what the transport costs in addition to this mean. And I think that means we really have to be, it's something we have to kind of focus on where we need it. But also, I think from a German industrial policy perspective, I wonder if we really put a lot of emphasis on hydrogen and ignore the energy component element, efficiency elements, then I think a lot of other locations that have far better access to directly use the renewable electricity that is used to make hydrogen directly will use the electricity in their locations. So I think if you want to give a longer term perspective for our industry, we have to make sure that we don't put all eggs on the hydrogen, but emphasize the new technologies that are more energy efficient along the supply chain as well.
I see that Karen is bursting with saying no. So she, on the way to Sonja and on the way to the audience, on the way to you, ladies and gentlemen, Karen, one brief remark.
No, I don't think it's an either or. I really don't think so. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about hydrogen because there basically hasn't been done in the past, but all the other technologies, we won't use hydrogen for passenger transport. We won't use hydrogen in places where you can actually do energy efficiency. For some, you can't even use it. I mean, it's completely different fields. So I don't believe that this is going to be a complete focus on one area, but I think there will be a package. And this is just one area for which we did not really know what to do. And now we're all going in that direction. And we're doing it, at least to some degree, in a kind of aligned in Europe. I mean, it gets kind of difficult if you choose different decarbonization pathways, for example, for heavy transport in France, in Germany, in Austria. So there has to be some type of coordination. I think that's happening right now. It will be interesting what happens in the US with respect to hydrogen. I think this can be, to some extent, also a game changer. That was longer than expected.
At this point, we cannot answer any of the questions that you are going to share with us, but it would be quite nice if you could just give us a spectrum of what has been said in the chat.
Yes, that's there's hints to some different technologies, like a person would be interested about the potential of tidal wave technologies. Another person was wondering about the nexus of biomass production and food sovereignty movement in Australia. So questions to specific technologies, and then there's also an open question on whether we need some real system change and away from the kind of capitalism we see today towards a completely different system. And I thought this is also a very general question, which is not really in the focus today, but of course an interesting one. But I think we should use the final 2 minutes or so to have some closing statements from our panelists, and that's why I give you the word again, Connie.
Thank you very much. My words exactly. So the challenge is 3 sentences from each on the absolute priorities. I know you can hardly do that, but Carsten will show you how it's done.
The European Commission.
Take away. Yeah.
I think we saw a lot of developments will happen in the different sectors and will require tailored policies. And I think there's a big opportunity now for Europe with this Green Deal package to provide a lot of the frameworks that are necessary for Europe to kind of move forward coordinatedly on this. I think Germany really should support the European Commission in implementing a suitable strategy in there. And then we have to really make sure that we roll this out for finding a way of engaging internationally at the same level.
Lovely. Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm just going to bring my pet point, which is the energy price reform at the German level. So I think this is something that's been said for years, and we all know that it's a really necessary reform to take on. And we also know how it should be done, because smart people from the Sachverständigenrat and the Energy Monitoring Commission have told us exactly how to do this. So it's just about getting on with it. So that would be my point for the policy makers.
Lovely. Karen.
3 sentences. One of the last questions I found really relevant. We have to not only look at climate, but also the basically nexus, biodiversity, food, climate, not only with respect to one dimension. Second topic, perhaps otherwise nobody probably brings it up. Developing countries really have to see that also due to the corona crisis, we're not losing them, and there's often less money involved than expected by people. And the third thing is, I think we have a lot of technologies. It's often the problem getting them into the market, crossing the valley of death. But where we do need more development is in the field of really carbon removal technologies, which we will need in the future, independent of our other decisions at the moment.
And a lot of IPCC studies include that already. So, Gabriel, last 3 sentences.
Thank you. We need to make sure that whatever we do at any level fosters global cooperation. I think that is key. Second, unilateral policies, and I'm talking here a little bit about carbon border adjustment and countering leakage, are inherently dangerous. A climate fortress Europe cannot be the solution. And the third point, because we don't know what the technologies are that will win the race, and we do not know who will actually be supplying clean energies in the future, climate protectionism is absolutely wrong, and we should resist it and try to bring down trade barriers so that we can, whatever the goods are, or the items are, or the energy sources are, rely on the global markets for global solutions. That's it.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Sonia, you take off your hat as a chat moderator. You're a professor yourself. You're in the discussion every day. Maybe your takeaway.
My takeaway. Most things were mentioned, and I was not really prepared to give my opinion.
I know.
But I mean, my pet project is still carbon pricing, and even though I don't think it is the only solution, I still think it's a central solution, because I think it really steers investment and structural change into the right direction. And I think also here we are at an interesting point. With Europe extending carbon pricing, with Germany going ahead in new sectors, with Europe now discussing an extension, a European extension to these sectors, with China just having started its emission trading system, with at least Biden announcing that he wants to have some national carbon pricing, even though this will be politically very difficult. And so I see a new window of opportunity of pushing carbon pricing internationally, and I would hope that we might see a minimum carbon price as an agreement between at least key players, and I think that might be an important step on the international level. And I know carbon pricing is not all, but I hope it will continue to play an even more important role than today.
Lovely. I can only say thank you to each and every one of you who has been here in the discussion room, and everybody who supplied questions and who was there. I see a number of people have already left, simply probably because they needed to get out. At the peak, we were just short of 100, so that's a grand achievement. We did move forward with international climate policy and global context. And I think if it was just us at the table at the COP26, we would come to an agreement. But I think the challenges are open there, and we've got a couple of months to cover until then. Thank you very much for your participation, and continue the good work on the Energy's Futures online conference in the next couple of days. So thank you very much, and let's do what's usual these days, do the usual sort of bye-bye, and thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for a great moderation, Connie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so very much.
And my job is now to kick you as the audience out of this room back to the lobby, and this as a nice button for this. So thank you also from my side for participating. And those who are left, I will kick back to the lobby now. So enjoy the rest of the